So I think it's wrong that we think we have to do lectures in our videos, in our offices, or in the places where, in TV studios. Let's do it outside where, you know, real life happens out here. One of the characteristics of a highly reliable team is that they're reluctant to blame. And I want to tell you a story that for me is really, really important. This is a story about a hospital group that I worked with in a small rural hospital. And there were 12 people in the room, all of them leaders in the hospital. And as we were talking through some leadership issues, one of them talked about a terrible, terrible accident that had occurred in their hospital. A respiratory patient had come into the emergency room. The respiratory therapist was called. A special piece of equipment was needed. They couldn't find the equipment, and when they finally did find it, it wasn't operational, and the patient died. And the respiratory therapist who happened to be in this leadership team was devastated. Even though it had happened weeks before, he was still upset about this, and he held himself to be at blame. He held himself responsible for the death of this patient, and he said, you know, it's likely that she would have died within a few weeks anyway, but we didn't give her our best care, and that was a big problem for us. As he talked through this issue, the head of nursing said, you know, that was really partly our fault too. We didn't train our nurses on that piece of equipment, and they didn't know how important it was, and they didn't call you early enough. And then the ambulance mobility people spoke up and said, you know, and when that patient was coming in, it was partly our fault because we could have radioed ahead, as we usually do, and said what kind of the condition the patient was in, and you would have been able to know to get this equipment ready. And then the facilities person stepped forward and said, you know, we're the ones who moved that piece of equipment, and we should have checked with you and been more careful about it. And the HR person stepped up and said, you know, part of it was our problem. We should have trained more. Each person on that leadership team took a portion of responsibility for that failure. That's one of the things about highly reliable teams that I think is very critical, is that they assume responsibility. Each person assumes responsibility for the whole team when there's a problem and when there's a success. And so it's really interesting to me in search and rescue teams how when the news media shows up, everybody's always pointing, go interview him, go interview that person. That person's the real hero today. They never want to assume credit. They never want to take credit for something, and they always share blame as well. And so I think that's a real important, critical part of this. And I think the one thing that you've got to look at in this particular lesson is the relationship between the reluctance to blame and the emotional intelligence of the group. So carefully read that article on emotional intelligence and see what kind of ideas about emotional intelligence you can incorporate into a highly reliable team. I hope this was helpful. Thanks.